just thought I'd give a little bit of an introduction to sort of frame the talk and give you know, some pointers for the discussion that we're going to have briefly, shortly. Just to get us thinking a little bit here, it's really not the best time right now to be a dead white male on a plinth. All over Europe and the United States, statues, as you know, are tumbling down. These people were slave traders, slave owners, colonizers, and all of them are kind of under review. The mayor of London has ordered every monument in this capital city to be sort of reviewed, revised, looked into, questioned. Across the UK, every statue to someone who lived between 1660 and 1811 is possibly going to be suspect, that there's going to be a review of all of that. Basically, even across the ocean, of course, in America, where arguably this movement really began. A statue of Teddy Roosevelt is coming down in New York because it's basically shows Teddy Roosevelt on a horse, but he's flanked by an African American and a Native American who are in native attire. And it is a problematic statue. And so therefore, this is kind of a debate that's sort of never ending. And we are really only at the start of it. So, I mean, what I'd like to really ask our panelists today is, what should we replace these sculptures with? And I think each of our panelists has their own perspective on this, because public sculpture has suddenly become something that everyone is talking about. It's not just some kind of twee thing that people, you know, in the art world are sort of concerning themselves with. So my first guest is the artist Zak Ové. Zak's work is in the collections of the British Museum. His work is, you know, huge installation of statues has filled the courtyard at Somerset House. Zak, your work has, in a sense, always been about underrepresented communities. Why do you think that? Why do you think that redress is such an important concern for you as an artist?
Well, I think as a child growing up here in London, when being taught British history in particular and looking at all these monuments around the city and around the country, it became very clear that we'd been written out of history in that sense. And I think for children of color in this country, having parented, or parents coming from the Caribbean, from Africa, from Asia, one thing that became apparent was that we didn't appear in the historical British narrative. And to me, it's quite overwhelming as a child to realize that you're not considered. And what that starts to implicate is how society is really structured to pitch you out. And I think we need to really consider how London and Britain can be more inclusive in heralding the great contributions from men and women that have really fortified British culture over the hundreds of years through slavery, to arrive at somewhere where we herald the invisible men and women who have really made Britain great in that sense. I think for me, that's really important. So what I've tried to do in my own practice is look at those, if you like, invisible men and women in history and try and give them some placement in the work I'm doing, some discussion, etc. With the pieces I put in Somerset House, I discovered that Africa hadn't actually been celebrated on that court for 400 years. And prior to that was The Mask of Blackness, written by Ben Jonson, which in it, Queen Anne, the wife of King James, revered a script in which 9 African princesses had to come to Britain to bathe in the Sea of Whiteness. So what I was interested in was a conversation, if you like, in the work I'm doing that looked at these moments in history and questions how we move forward from there. My review,
Yeah, and so before I move on, because I mean, we're gonna kind of like toggle between you. I just wondered, you know, just following on from that, what sorts of artworks do you see, do you envision if you were the mayor of London and you could tear down all the statues you didn't like, what would you put up in their place?
I mean, I'd like to see things that bring conversation back to life about those contributions. What about the great Black British men and women that we look at and read about in history that have no place in the city? There are tons of people. Ulrich Cross from the RAF from the Second World War. Claudia Jones, who came here and was one of the pioneers of the Notting Hill Carnival. Even a monument to Stephen Lawrence that reminds us, or would remind us, of who not to be in that instance. You know, so I think overall, I'd like to see also, I mean, statues, sculptures that speak about those experiences and really, again, reveres those contributions. You know.
Yeah. Simon, you're the director of the Pallant House Gallery, which is a beautiful 18th century townhouse in Chichester. And you have a beautiful collection of modern British sculpture, but you have your own sort of views on this topic. And what is your vantage point on it?
Well, I think clearly we are in a moment where we need to really listen and consider all kinds of voices on this topic. Sculpture has become, in the last few weeks, something which is very contentious, and it has become, I think there's a differentiation that we have to recognize between statues and sculpture. I think there is, it's a subtle differentiation, but I think it's an important one. I think particularly when we consider if pieces are to be taken down, what they might be replaced with, because I think it's possible to go down a very literal route. And I think actually, you know, as Zak says, honoring individuals has a long civic tradition. I mean, it's, as we've recently discovered, it's not without its problems, because all of these individuals, such as in Bristol, they have complex personal histories, and absolutely, you know, nobody, I think, would want to honour a slave trader today.
When you say that we should differentiate between statues and sculptures, can you elaborate on that? What do you mean?
Yeah, I mean, I think particularly in terms of modernism and in terms of contemporary art, I think sculpture has a place to carry nuance that isn't about glorifying an individual. And I think one of the things I'm very conscious of, because I'm on the Fabric Advisory Committee for Chichester Cathedral, which of course has a number of religious sculptures within it, but also memorials to individuals. And conversations have come up in the past over at what point does a memorial go up in a 900-year-old cathedral, when things might emerge about some of those individuals after their death, you know, which has often happened, which can become very problematic. And so I think there's the test of time there. But I think with modern and contemporary sculpture, it can be about formal values, it can be about ideas. And I think where it addresses those, there's greater space for inclusion and a diversity of views held within an individual piece. And I think one of the great opportunities in this moment is actually about commissioning a wider and more diverse range of artists. And I think I mean, I'm very intrigued by the point you're making, the distinction you're making between statues, you know, just plain old effigies of person X, and sculptures. So can you explain a little bit what you know, I'm trying to envision what you well, I mean, my personal view is often that figurative sculptures can be beautiful things. They often don't look anything like the person. I mean, I think we'll often look at a sculpture. I mean, there are a lot of famous cases of commissioned sculptures of individuals that don't really capture anything about their personal, what they represent. And I think... Yeah,
and there to revere their namesake as well.
And what I think is so remarkable, for example, about Gillian Waring's recent sculpture in Parliament Square is it carries ideas as well as recognizing an individual. In a way, Millicent Fawcett, which is the first woman in Parliament Square, most people today have no idea what Millicent Fawcett looked like. And yet the banner, Courage Calls to Courage Everywhere, it can be about any woman, and it can be about the power of democracy and ideas. And I think that is where a sculpture today can be more powerful in a way that, of course, it recognizes the individual, but it recognizes the significance of what they did beyond that. So that's a figurative example, of course.
Okay. I mean, basically, I'm just having each of you introduce your ideas, and then we can have a mingled discussion. So kind of we're taking turns right now. And so we're going to move on to Polly. And Polly, I'm just going to throw the question open to you, and you take it wherever you want to take it. But let's say you were the mayor of London, you know, and you had the chance to sort of revisit some of these public monuments. You know, what would you do? How would you redesign our city?
Wow, well, that's a great question, and wow, I'd love to do that, quite honestly. It would be a great opportunity to engage so many artists who I'm sure would love to have a go. I mean, I personally am not sure that I do make the distinction between statuary and public sculpture. It's all in the public realm. We've all got a responsibility to scrutinize it. And I think the power of public sculpture has been clearly illustrated in the last few weeks, and we should embrace the energy behind it. I like Banksy's idea of you know, adapting a sculpture that's already in existence, and that could be a possibility. I would really love to see us consider it very carefully, as Simon says, but at the same time not lose momentum. And I would like it to really see public sculpture as a reflection of ourselves as we are now, and not to be scared of having to perhaps remove a sculpture in 100 years' time. I mean, we're not a listed building. We're not, the beauty of sculpture is that it can be taken down and put in a different context. So that would be my approach.
What do you think, Zak? I mean, about what we've just heard from Simon and from Polly, which is to say, Simon is of the view that statues perhaps are, you know, not perhaps the best, figurative statues are not perhaps the best way to commemorate these people, and that we can evoke them through ideas, through, you know, that sort of thing, just sort of get something that they embodied and bounce off that. What do you think of that idea?
Absolutely. And I think I tried to think about this last night as well, the difference between statues and sculpture. And I think one of the things that is really drawing about sculpture is the fact that it can convey emotion, feelings,
right.
Human experience beyond just the namesake of the individual. And I think what we look at often, or really take on board, are works of art, installations, sculptures that have that conveyance, something that moves you emotionally, that when, you know, there's a before and an after in the experience. And I would like to see more works that convey those sensibilities. I mean, when we look at situations like slavery or a Holocaust or whatever, how do you make a work that conveys feeling in that sense? And I think that is partly what differentiates statue making and sculpture for me in that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there is the risk, though, that that when we commemorate a new set of people, let's say that we do commemorate them with figurative statues, let's say, yeah, or however we commemorate them, that we then kind of become sort of very worthy, or let's say value-oriented in the way that we pick these statues. And is that going to make great art? Because the bronze statues that are tumbling down, I think that we all agree, are not examples of great art and you know, fantastic. Do you know what I mean? They're not the world's most inspiring works of art. The statue of Colston that ended up in the river in Bristol, yeah, is, as I said, I mean, it's not the world's most riveting work of art. So is there a risk that we might replace these bronze, you know, effigies with new effigies that are also just commemorations of people and that aren't very artistically exciting?
Well, I hope not. I really hope not. I think, yeah, firstly, to put something where there's been a removal it needs to incite conversation. The work has to then develop a dialogue as to why that work was removed and why it's being put in its place. I think it's an interesting situation. I mean, the work I did, The Invisible Man, was a collection of 40 statues, all with their hands up. And what I wanted to do in the repetition of that was make the point that these people are invisible. And I thought that that was a really nice way of doing that, because it allowed you to mingle with a group of people that you would otherwise render completely not there. And I likened that experience to, if you like, Black homelessness in the United States, where these people are dismissed. So I think, again, it's up to the imagination of the artist in how to find creative ways through these endeavors. But I think that's part of what's exciting about making works of art for situations like this, is how do we then incite the conversation that moves beyond, if you like, the statue of the slave trader's legacy, right? To really incite something that is provoking, not only in disputing what was, but in also asking what should be, right? How do we come together? How do we move beyond that? So I'd be very excited to look at works of art that really, if you like, endeavor in that conversation, in their materialism and how they're put out.
Simon, I'm coming back to you on this. I was just wondering what your views are on this particular point, which is to say, I mean, Zak was just evoking, I think Zak was just evoking the idea of that Banksy had brought up, or someone else maybe had brought that up, but, you know, this business of, you know, let's sort of evoke or represent the act of destruction in the new sculpture that we'll see in its place. So what Banksy is saying is, let's pull the statue out of the river where it's already out of the river. Let's put it back on there, but then show also the people who tore it down. And so sculpt them. So kind of make a sort of almost a performance, a frozen performance out of it. What do you think of that idea?
Well, clearly there's something very interesting about when a sculpture, when a statue stops being about history and becomes history itself. And I think that's particularly what's happened in this case. And it's become far more than that particular statue. I mean, I think this is something, of course, the sculptor Hugh Locke has previously engaged with that sculpture and kind of added to it in a way. I think it's an interesting question for museums, because there are museums across the UK and internationally which have often problematic statues, sculptures within their collections. One of the interesting things is how to create a space around those for people to engage with history and I think sometimes installations, people like Hans Hacker, who actually will take an object from a collection and place it into an installation and actually create new narratives around it. I think there's a lot of opportunity for museums to deal with this and actually to deal with their own histories at the moment, because every museum in the country at the moment is trying to think what they can do about the past, because museums are about making the past relevant today. And, you know, for example, as us at Pallant House Gallery, we don't fortunately have anything in our collection. Our collection was put together in the last 35 years that has this kind of colonial resonance in that sense, or kind of connections to slavery as far as we are aware at this point. But equally, we need to be able to create a space to have those conversations. But I think it's up, we have a shared responsibility, I think, to kind of face history and to face ourselves and look to the future as well. I think museums have to look to the future with their collections. And I think this is where commissioning artists, looking at dialogues, creating conversations with audiences about the things that they have in their collections, and often they can be very, very triggering for different people for different reasons. And I think we have to recognize that actually something which people, for example, the sculpture in Bristol, people walked past that every day. A lot of people would never have even thought about it. And yet for other people, it would be a deeply triggering sculpture. And I think we have to understand that it's not just a piece of street furniture, I think for lots of people, it's a historic piece of street furniture. And suddenly, when the reality of its history is exposed, it becomes a charged object, which is deeply contentious. And so that, I think, is where museums and galleries can create a safe space for dialogue, for all kinds of different voices to consider these issues.
So Polly, let's hear it from you. You know, Simon was just making the point that this is really an opportunity to commission sculpture, and I think that's one of your bugbears. Can you pick up on that idea?
Well, it is a bugbear that we don't often look to home. Well, we do, but this is an opportunity to do it really well, and to you know, really consider what makes good public sculpture, and really almost take a look back towards the 50s, where sculptors were being commissioned left, right and center, and obviously that's going to be possibly difficult now because of funding. You know, who's going to pay for this? The local councils are under a lot of pressure, but you know, we're creative, and I think that is that shouldn't hold anyone back. I just think that this isn't a problem that's going to be instantly rectified, but that we can start working on it now and really get into it.
We have Rod Keenan here writing in, and he says, Trafalgar Square rotates statues, that's sort of a performance. And it is, and I mean, I think that that's a really good point. The fourth plinth, the empty plinth in Trafalgar Square competition that's been going on for quite a number of years, that's actually kind of been a dress rehearsal for what we're going through historically in the present day. You know, this empty plinth has been filled in hundreds of different ways, or a dozen different ways by a variety of artists. I mean, what do you think of the fourth plinth commission? You know, as a sort of dress rehearsal for what we're living through.
If that's aimed at me, I think it's fantastic. Oh, yeah. I think it shows how flexible sculpture can be, and how innovative, and how it doesn't need to be this thing that stays and lasts for a million years. I mean, that's also got its relevance. But like I said, the public sculpture has to reflect who we are now. And that would be a really interesting way to do it. And also, if we're going to be stretched with funds to perhaps do this now, isn't that a great way of perhaps looking at less expensive materials, you know, smaller budgets, and involve more people? It's a discussion. And how
so
great.
What do you mean? I mean, what do you mean by that? Like less expensive materials? Like, could you be more specific?
I think a lot of the problem with monuments and sort of statuary and in commissions, if you want to put it in those terms, is it often comes down to the budgets, and the fact that sculpture, number one, takes a long time to make and is expensive, and has to be very safe. It's out in the public realm. It's difficult, and so if we could find a way that you could do that without the, I don't want to diminish it being in bronze, because that would be even more fantastic, but there are ways of getting around small budgets.
Such as, I mean, can I get you to be more, all the speakers to be more specific here? We need more examples from you. Like, what do you mean? Well, like, instead of, we can't really put a paper mache sculpture on the fourth plinth. We can't.
You could if you covered it in resin. It wouldn't last a huge amount of time, and it would probably not be in good shape afterwards. But you know, there are creative ways around it, and I think we could. You know, artists are very good at finding those.
Bouncing off of what Polly was just saying, you know, this idea of sculpture doesn't have to be, you know, a bronze effigy for all time. I mean, this is something all of you have evoked.
Yeah.
So what kind of materials could we use that as Polly was saying, you know, that don't have to be bronze?
Sadly, Farah, still at this point in my career, I've never had the chance to make a bronze because of the cost. And what's been fascinating for me specifically is how to get around that situation time after time after time. I was commissioned by the British Museum to make 2 pieces for the Great Hall, but sadly, the money they had to offer me was less than £10,000 to erect 2 pieces at 7 meters high. So not only did I have to find money for that situation, but I had to think outside the box again at how I could make something that would be safe in that space and last. I found myself using mannequins, found objects, stirred worlds from skips, all kinds of things. With the Invisible Men, another good example, I had to use graphite with resin as opposed to using bronze to make 40 pieces to that scale, because there's no way I could have afforded to do that in a metal foundry. To be honest with you, it's a really interesting conversation, and there are a lot of ways of making permanent works of art or semi-permanent works of art that could be on rotation. I think the problem is the longer you want something to last, obviously it needs to be based in something that has weight and is impenetrable. But in realms of public art making, I mean, these days you can use pretty much anything if you're thoughtful about how you put the construct together and where it's going to be placed. So okay. I don't think in any way that this thing of only ever having a bronze in that situation should be the way forward. Coming back to a couple of the other points you made, I thought Banks's idea of the statue was absolutely phenomenal in the way that it kind of encases or documents a moment in history that encapsulates another moment in history to take it somewhere else. I do wonder, though, if that works in every situation, and if en masse, the idea of, if you like, all of these monuments that have been to slave traders, etc., do play a major part in indoctrination. I wonder then, I guess my feelings, and what I'm really getting to, is that if the statues that are removed come down, I'm okay with that. But what might be interesting is to put them into a museum or somewhere off public space where they can be reviewed in a new way, where we can have works around them and a discussion. But I am very keen to see them gone.
Yeah, we have an anonymous attendee who sadly won't give their name, who just came in with a question, saying David Osloga recently suggested sculptures that recently been pulled down should be installed in museums so they don't disappear.
Agree.
They become part of the cultural narrative, and I'd like to put that to Simon.
I completely agree.
Simon, you run a museum, and I realize it's a museum of sort of modern British sculpture, but so how do you feel about this idea of these knocked down statues sort of ending up in museums, and possibly let us know how you'd feel if one of them ended up in your museum?
Well, I think absolutely. I mean, I agree that they shouldn't just be melted down, because I think we can't just erase history, and history is problematic, it's difficult, and it continues to affect us today. And that's why I think we have to create space for it. I think there is an issue with, to pick up on Polly's previous point, which is about museums collecting and commissioning sculptures, that most museums these days have huge issues with storage. And so not only are their budgets for commissioning sculpture pretty tight, and actually to do ambitious sculpture commissioning, particularly as Zak has said, with materials like bronze, the resources to do this are enormous. And so in relation to that point, I think one of the things is temporary commissioning, where things might subsequently then get sold and there's recoupment for the organizations, as a way for things to have a place in programs. And this is something that we've done in the past at Pallant House Gallery, where we've commissioned sculptors, we've shown work. For example, Laura Ford made a series of figures which were there for about 2 years in our courtyard garden, and then some of them were then subsequently sold on, with the money going back to go into a fund for future commissions. And this I think is an interesting possibility. This is something also that sculpture parks will often do, where an amount will go towards the artist, and an amount will go to a fund for commissioning new work. And that also deals with the issue of not necessarily building up these vast collections that can't be shown. The question of historical sculptures is a complex one, because actually you then get into the question of, do people actually want these statues in terms of the communities? If people then, there are all kinds of issues around that, and that is where I think the interpretation, the dialogue becomes absolutely paramount, because actually, if we are to create a space around these to address these issues, that's where they can't just ad infinitum be glorifications of now problematic individuals. So I think, you know, it is an issue, and I think probably also the context of where these pieces might go.
Yeah, I mean, Polly, can I bounce back to you? Do we have audio with Polly?
Yes.
Yeah. Hi. Polly, I mean, when we were having a little chit chat yesterday on the phone, all of us, you were mentioning that you represent a lot of women sculptors. And I think Zak was mentioning that there are not enough women up on those plinths. Zak was saying that he went to San Francisco and that there were only 2 women who were glorified with statues in San Francisco, and one of them was Florence Nightingale. So we've got a gender problem as well as, you know, a kind of race problem here. Yeah, so could you talk about that? Yeah.
Yeah, I think we have a gender problem still in the art world, and obviously collectively we've got to carry on working. We're getting there slowly, but there's still a lot of road to go. I think the whole education system as well, sadly, needs looking at when it comes to sculpture as well. There are less and less places that you can go to actually get your hands on welding equipment and actually have a studio space and you know, really get your teeth into how you actually make these things. Obviously, the digital is a fantastic tool. And,
yeah, but let's come back to the issue of women here, because I mean, I really would like to hear from you, because you represent a lot of women, and you are a woman, and I'm a woman. How can we address this? You know, how can we address this?
We are addressing it. You know, we've got a Windrush monument that's due next year, that's being made by both Thomas J. Price and Veronica Ryan, so that's fantastic. I think
where's that going to be?
That's going to be in Hackney.
Oh, excellent.
So that's fantastic. So you know, and Gillian Waring, you know, we're getting there with women making sculptures in the public realm, and they have been for a long time. It's just we need to keep looking at the diversity when we're looking at committees, and but ultimately we run a residency program at the gallery, which is quite unusual, and that is really to help, as Zak was saying, push artists to look at making sculpture in bronze, and part of the residency program is a casting budget, and we've just got to keep showing women and showing all sculptors from any background. It's not about their background, it's about what they make. And but if the art schools aren't being inclusive, or not that they would sort of outwardly not be inclusive, but if there aren't good sculpture courses and the opportunity to get into sculpture in the first place, then how on earth are we going to maintain that?
Yeah, I see. Zak, can I get you to talk about the issue of women?
I mean, last year I curated Get Up, Stand Up Now at Somerset House. That show extended itself to 110 artists, really looking at the history of Black British arts in the UK and beyond. I tried to pull in probably, 35–40% of the artists on show were women. It was a real struggle to get that many women of colour into one show and to find them, etc. But I do think overall that the idea of sculpture isn't pushed enough in that sense. It's still a very male world, and needs to be redressed, that young girls actually see themselves as the future sculptors on the scene. And also, for me, it's a little bit problematic in that there aren't enough people being recognized in that way. I'm often contacted by other sculpture parks for recommendations of women or people of color to make new contributions. And there are a lot of people out there, but I think it's very hard to get a break. It's a really hard medium to persist in, because not only once you've made work, you have to store your own work. Now, if you're not in a position where you're selling and that you have a big income, it's a really difficult hustle right now in London to have a studio and store your own work. So it's a real struggle. What I hope is that there can be more commissions. I'd love to see competitions that attract women, or sculptural competitions specifically that kind of entice this conversation, right? That give them a place.
Yeah. Let's go.
We were talking before about things like, well, I guess my point really is, how do we get more women into the sculpture world moving forward?
Okay. Yeah. Simon, this is a question that's coming to us from Laura Martinez, one of our listeners today, our viewers, and she says, as a tactile 3D medium, I think sculpture is an art form with particular appeal to children. Could the panel comment on the role sculptures had to play in education today, in a world where learning is increasingly flat and virtual? I mean, there is that, right? You know, we're all sitting here zoomed away from each other. We're in a non-tactile world, and we'll probably be in a non-tactile world for the foreseeable future. But once we kind of stop being non-tactile, I mean, do you think of ways in which your museum could engage with children because of the tangibility of what you show?
Absolutely. I mean, I think there is something which is very, very immediate about sculpture for children. I mean, often because it exists in their space, I think they just accept it as it is, as something in their world rather than a depiction of something beyond. And I think we have a big collection of British pop art at Pallant House Gallery, which includes sculptures by Edoardo Paolozzi. And Paolozzi, of course, had a huge sense of play. He collected toys. He made his sculptures from combinations of children's toys pressed into wax, which were then cast. So, for example, we have a couple of sculptures which are pretty much robots, and they are the most brilliant thing for engaging children, because they kind of immediately accept them as something that is like, that has a sense of play, and they can understand because it's part of their world. During lockdown, I mean, picking up on your point about the virtual world, we were trying to work out how to engage with homeschooling parents who were desperately running out of things to do, and we actually produced a series of downloadable children's kits, and one of these was a make your own Paolozzi robot inspired by one, you know, a kind of, you could print it out in paper and make it, and it was, you know, really, really popular because how you translate these ideas into activities. But just to go back to the previous point about women sculptors, I think this is something also that museums have to address. And I think we are fortunate at Pallant House Gallery that we have wonderful sculptures by some of the leading women sculptors, such as Barbara Hepworth, and we're just in the process of acquiring a really significant group of works by Elizabeth Frink, who historically has not had the same level of critical acclaim perhaps as her contemporaries, which I, in a way, think for quite a lot of her work was quite an undeserved situation, that actually she has a lot to say. But I think there's also two of the sculptors that we've actually worked with in the last year at Pallant House Gallery. One is Jan Howarth, an American sculptor, but she worked in Britain for a number of years and was very much part of the pop art movement in Britain. She actually has always produced sculptures in soft fabrics, rather like Klaus Oldenburg, using fabric and stitch. And she has said that actually, in a way, it was a rejection of the masculinity of bronze, that bronze and stone were associated with men working with their heart, you know, their hands. And actually, she wanted something which was about a feminine language, which was something that she felt was her own. And of course, a lot of her work has been about gender. Similarly, we've also worked with Kathy Pilkington, who's just recently been made Keeper of the Royal Academy Schools, and of course, a contemporary sculptor. And she created this extraordinary installation called Working from Home. And she created a whole series of almost doll-like mannequins, which, and to go back to that point about bronze, the installation as we presented it was painted plaster, cast painted plaster and gypsumite. And the key central piece was an intervention with an 18th century four-poster bed with a number of different figures on it, responding elements in our collection. And the great thing is we were able to make an application, and Kathy is the first artist in many years to have received funding from the George Frampton Fund to cast into permanent materials a sculpture. So this installation will be cast into bronze for our collection, but then it's going to be painted. So actually, the reality is it will look almost exactly the same as the plaster version, but we'll have that permanent. So artists are also kind of engaging in different ways of representing.
I understand. No, I mean, the whole issue, you know, fabric. I mean, fabric has certainly been used by Joana Vasconcelos throughout her career. I mean, everything she does is pretty much knitted, you know, and textile. And Louise Bourgeois has made a lot of, you know, as we know, the women artists, you know, for decades have been doing work in fabric. I think that I would go back to Polly and put a question from Jago Sloan. You know, Polly, you were talking about, and this is something all of you have touched on, the sheer cost and monumentality of engaging in these bronze public sculptures. And that, you know, you could make sculptures that were smaller and perhaps with more economic material. But so Jago is asking, given the challenge of cost, do you think that much smaller scale sculpture is important, or does it, you know, does the lack of scale sort of diminish the impact of the sculpture? I mean, we do have the problem of scale to address in public sculpture.
Yeah, absolutely. And part of the power of sculpture is that kind of visceral response to monumental sculpture. It does something completely different to a small, intimate handheld piece, of course. And the budgets are problematic for that, because not only if you want to go big, do you have to go big, but you have to have the engineering, you have to have the safety element to it. I think, but then large sculpture isn't always necessary. You know, an intimate sculpture in a niche can have as much power, or in a corner of a building, a forgotten corner can have just as much power as something monumental. So I don't think it's necessarily about scale.
Yeah, interesting. Going back to Zak on something that he was telling me when we were having our chat yesterday. Zak, you were mentioning that you really liked the big Cara Walker Fonsus Americanus work, which is in the Turbine Hall and will still be there when Tate reopens, Tate Modern reopens. But you were saying, you know, this is a great work and I love it, but couldn't they have sort of commissioned a British sculptor to deliver something on the legacy of slavery?
On the British legacy of slavery, particularly,
yeah.
Yeah, and I was just scared in that moment that Black British artists, in that sense, of being slightly undermined by their American counterparts, literally through the weight of the gallery system, and how they're enabled to reach or kind of ascertain a stardom that's not considered for Black artists in this country in the same way. To me, I you know, obviously the Tate, a homegrown institution built on sugar plantations throughout the Caribbean and Africa. We would hope that you will salute us and help us to endeavour to tell our own story here in the UK. So I think, yeah, if they could show more commitment to things like that, that would be wonderful. It's important that we embrace each other as Brits.
There is Tate Britain, right? There's a whole institution.
Yeah. Well, Tate Britain right now are working on a fantastic show for next year, which will look at artists working between London and the Caribbean. We're in discussion about that. They've got a really amazing lineup for that. And I think there are other great situations to be addressed. But in specific, when we're looking at works that speak about the history of Britain's involvement in the Caribbean and Africa, I think there are some wonderful artists in this country that could make incredible works to discuss those historical topics. And it would be nice to see them included. Versus, if you like, you know, the Tate or somebody looking abroad to find somebody else to tell our story for us.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to spice up the conversation a bit and ask a kind of slightly spiky, slightly controversial question. I mean, it's not that controversial, but I mean, I just wanted to know what each of you thought when you saw the statue of Edward Colston being pulled down and thrown into the river. What that sort of evoked. I mean, you know, there are a lot of people who on Twitter and people who are intellectuals and you know, professionals who were sort of endorsing that, and they thought it was cool, they liked it. And then there were other people who were uncomfortable. I just don't know where you guys sat with that. I don't know which of you want to take that on first.
Mine was a very practical response. It was like, wow, how did they do that? Because I move sculpture all the time and do it really carefully and, you know, with much planning. And it was an incredible image that I don't think I'll ever forget, that footage of it coming down and then going at speed along the road. I've never seen a sculpture do that. But I felt a sort of a sense of release. I thought, wow, that is quite extraordinary.
Yeah, it was. I mean, it's quite a dramatic thing. And I don't mean to put any of you on the spot. I just wanted you to sort of share your thoughts on this sort of phenomenon we're seeing right now.
Well, I have to say, I was very excited to see it happen.
Yeah.
It was a direct response to injustice that's been taking place for a long time in relation to the George Floyd killing. And all of the years, if you like, of suppression in that sense. And it was very exciting to see a people's moment that said, no, enough is enough. We're done with this, right? We need equality and we need to begin. And so for me, it's a very exciting moment. It's led to this debate. It's led to so many other debates. It's led to us to re-question society and how we want to react to one another and move forward. I think it's a wonderful thing. I'm not in accordance that history should be removed, but I think to watch that come down was actually quite an exciting moment, because what it speaks about is what's possible in the future and how we rebuild. Yeah,
well, if history can't be removed, but then on the other hand, you know, Zak likes to see the statue pulled down. So where does one draw the line, Simon? I mean, how do we?
Sorry, can I just interrupt? It's not that it's the statue being pulled down. It's also what it represents. It's what he represented. It was all of the colonization behind that, and the fact that it doesn't really play a part right now in who we are moving forward. So it's not that I've got any thing against the artwork itself. It was the representation of the man and his legacy that I was happy to see removed in that sense.
Yeah. No, but I mean, we are, as Zak and Polly are both saying, I mean, we do need to sort of not forget history. So Simon, as a director of a museum, how would you make sure that we don't get forgetful by dumping all these statues in the river?
Well, I think clearly it's very much like when the period of communism came to an end in Eastern Europe and statues of Stalin were taken down. Essentially, it's a marker in our kind of collective psyche. And I think we have to recognize it as that this extraordinary moment is very charged and symbolic for all of us, you know, and we have to choose how we respond to that. You know, we have to, you know, and I guess in that situation, I mean, I find it really, there's an onus on us in museums and galleries to respond in the right way and to respond thoughtfully. Museums in a way cannot be in the position of taking down statues and rolling them down the hill, because we have a collective responsibility to care for the objects that we hold,
yeah,
whether or not we agree with the values they represent or not. And I think that's a real challenge for us, because lots of museums and galleries have deeply problematic objects. And I think what we have to then do is to find a way for people to understand the lessons from that. So I guess I would be a little bit more circumspect in that respect. But you know, we have to look to the future, and we have to look to a future where we are not glorifying deeply problematic individuals and ideas. And I think this is what this is about. It's actually, what is the challenge as we move to the future?
I mean, they weren't problematic when the statues were made. I've got to go to Polly next. Sorry, Zach. I have a question for Polly from our audience. Yeah, I mean, the statues weren't problematic when they were put up. These were obviously people who were glorified, and what they did was not considered wrong. So, you know, our values shift, and that's a good thing, but, you know, also creates complications. We have Emma McVitie writing in, Polly, and I'm going to shoot this one to you. Talking of the youth of today, perhaps we can build on the Steve McQueen initiative involving your 3 primary school children, engage with art students and teenagers to create a similar evolved initiative around sculpture. What I mean, you know, you always talk about being more inclusive and how these commissions have to reach out to a more inclusive range of people. Isn't that, you know, is that a way of doing it?
I think so. I think education in schools is really, really important. I think, and the education of how sculpture's made. I mean, a lot of people have a clue on how a bronze is made. So getting hands-on experience right from the outset is great. I think if the part of your question is towards being inclusive with schools and public communities in public sculpture, I think that has a place in certain commissions, but is very difficult to marry both things. So I'm not sure whether the question is getting at that.
It's hard to marry public schooling and public sculpture. Is that what you're saying? It's hard to get.
No.
Sorry.
No, I don't know whether the question is saying could commissions include schools and sculptures. I think the commissioning is in itself a difficult, you know, a process that needs to happen with the artists. But the opportunity to have engagement after a sculpture has been put up is key, and definitely should be considered. But the actual commissioning of the sculpture with an element of you know, schools being involved, I would see as being quite difficult to work.
Logistically a bit difficult. Well,
not just the artist's integrity, you know, that what they're trying to commit and express is then sometimes a bit difficult to then say, well, the school wants, you know, the parameter here is that schools and education needs to be considered too. I would wonder whether that would dilute how the artist was expressing that. I'm not sure I've understood the question correctly.
No, I think you did. I think we're okay. If I'm not mistaken, I think our chat has come to an end. So all I'd like to do now is really thank our excellent panelists. You've brought a very, very diverse and a very sort of differentiated and varied response to the questions that we've had today. And so I really appreciate the fact that Simon Martin, Zak Ové, and Polly, is it Bielecka?
Yes, very good.
Bielecka have been with us today. And so on Masterpiece's behalf, I'm only the moderator. I'd like to thank you all for being with us. Thank you very much for joining this webinar.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Farah.